August 7th, 1942. On the beaches of Guadalcanal, a great victory seemed secured. 11,000 U.S. Marines, the spearhead of Operation Watchtower, had landed with surprising ease. The Japanese defenders, mostly construction crews, had fled into the jungle, leaving their half-eaten breakfast behind. The Marines had captured the objective, the strategic airfield, almost without firing a shot. Yet, their elation was tragically premature. While the men of the 1st Marine Division rested on their laurels, setting up perimeter on the newly christened Henderson Field, the naval forces protecting them were sailing directly into a catastrophic failure of intelligence, doctrine, and leadership. This failure would culminate in a single, brutal night that delivered the U.S. Navy its worst defeat in its 167-year history. The battle was the Battle of Savo Island, fought in the early hours of August 9th, 1942. It was a humiliating, almost unbelievable defeat. 4 Allied heavy cruisers sunk, another damaged, and over 1,000 sailors killed. The event did not just cost ships and lives, it forced the immediate withdrawal of the U.S. Navy and abandoned the Marines on Guadalcanal to their fate. A desperate struggle for survival, known in history as the Crucible of the Pacific. To understand this naval disaster is to analyze a perfect storm of tactical arrogance, fractured command, and the terrifying unknown mastery of the enemy. The stage for disaster was set not by Japanese guns, but by flawed Allied command structure. The entire operation was a messy patchwork of responsibilities. Admiral Robert L. Gormley was the overall commander of the South Pacific. He was notably gloomy and ill-prepared, having left Washington convinced the U.S. was not ready for such an aggressive action. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher commanded the powerful carrier task force, the Essential Air Umbrella. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner commanded the amphibious support force, the transports and protecting cruisers responsible for getting the Marines and their supplies onto the beach. The fatal decision. The key weakness was Admiral Fletcher's fear. Already gun-shy from Coral Sea and nervous about risking his precious carriers, Fletcher abruptly announced he would withdraw his carrier protection after only 2 days, arguing that the loss of 21 planes out of 99 to Japanese raids was too high a price. He insisted the carriers must not be risked. This decision was relayed to Admiral Gormley, who, in his characteristic indecisiveness, offered no countermand. Fletcher did not wait for approval. He withdrew his carriers before he even received a reply. This left Turner's force, the transports laden with supplies and their cruiser escort, vulnerable, stripped of the vital air cover that had been guaranteed. Admiral Turner was furious, yet helpless. He knew this withdrawal would leave his force exposed to the inevitable Japanese counterattack, but his mission to unload the 17,000 Marines and their supplies was paramount. The clock was ticking, and the American command structure, designed to prevent loss, had instead created the conditions for a massacre. While the Allies were paralyzed by anxiety and confusion, the Japanese had a clear, decisive commander, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commander of the 8th Fleet at Rabaul. Mikawa, a specialist in torpedo warfare and night combat, understood the assignment: destroy the Allied support fleet, cut the supply line, and starve the Marines into submission. The Japanese advantage: night fighting mastery. The Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN, had spent years perfecting night fighting doctrine known as Yasen, night battle. Their key assets included superior optics. Japanese lookouts used binoculars with larger lenses and higher magnification, giving them a decisive edge in low-light conditions compared to Allied radar technology of the time, which was still rudimentary and unreliable for precision targeting. The long-lance torpedo. The Type 93 oxygen-propelled torpedo was the world's finest. It was smokeless, wakeless, traveled at phenomenal speeds, up to 50 knots, and had a devastating range of nearly 20 nautical miles, far surpassing any Allied torpedo. It was the ultimate weapon for a surprise night attack. The approach: through the slot. Mikawa, knowing he had no air cover and was outnumbered by the total Allied forces, relied on surprise. He assembled 5 heavy cruisers: Chokai, Flagship, Aoba, Kako, Kinugasa, Furutaka, 2 light cruisers and 1 destroyer. His route was audacious, a high-speed run down the New Georgia Sound, dubbed the Slot by the Americans. A funnel that led directly into the unpro Mikawa's plan was simple and flawless. Approach under cover of darkness. Launch a massive torpedo salvo at the vulnerable Allied ships from beyond the range of U.S. light detection. Finish off the crippled ships with concentrated gunfire. Escape back up the Slot before dawn, when Allied air power could retaliate. The disaster was preventable, but a comedy of errors in Allied intelligence ensured Mikawa's surprise was complete. 0759. The fatal intelligence gaps. The initial sighting. Mikawa's force was sighted early on August 7th by an Australian reconnaissance plane. The pilot, correctly identifying the force, sent a contact report. However, due to multiple retransmissions and a flawed reporting chain, the crucial part of the message, the heading and speed, indicating a high-speed run towards Guadalcanal, was deleted or garbled during transmission from Rabaul. The American command believed the force was merely headed back to Rabaul. The submarine report: the American submarine S-38 sighted Mikawa's force emerging from St. George's Channel on the evening of August 7th and reported the contact. However, this report was not given much credence by naval commanders, who considered ship movements in that area normal. The missing search. Admiral Turner had looked at his charts and knew the Slot was the most obvious approach. He requested a special air search there for the following day, August 8th. The message was lost somewhere between Admiral Turner's flagship and the seaplane tender at Munda. The search was never made. Thus, on August 8th, the most critical, obvious approach for a Japanese naval force to Guadalcanal was completely uncovered. The Americans were blind. As the Marines slept and the Allied support ships bobbed in the 2 exposed formations, Northern Force and Southern Force, Mikawa's force slipped past the sentinel point of Savo Island at 1:33 a.m. on August 9th. The blind sentinels. The Allied force was divided into 3 sections. Northern Force, USS Vincennes, USS Quincy, USS Astoria, U.S. cruisers. Southern Force, HMAS Canberra, Australian, USS Chicago, U.S. Eastern Force, USS Australia, USS Chicago, and 2 U.S. destroyers commanded by British Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley. Admiral Crutchley, the commander of the entire screen, had inexplicably decided to steam away from the line to confer with Admiral Turner aboard the transport Macaulay. He was away from the battle line when the attack came, severely compromising the chain of command. The Japanese launched torpedoes first at the Southern Force. HMAS Canberra was hit immediately by 2 torpedoes and subsequent gunfire. The ship was utterly unprepared. The lookouts, mistaking the incoming Japanese ships for friendly destroyers, did not sound the alarm in time. Canberra was devastated in minutes and sank the next morning. USS Chicago was hit by a torpedo, blowing off its bow. Its commander, though surviving, failed to transmit a clear warning to the other Allied ships, believing the attack was a smaller, localized threat. The Northern Force annihilation. Mikawa then expertly wheeled his ships north toward the 3 American cruisers. The Northern Force was caught entirely by surprise. USS Astoria, hit repeatedly by Mikawa's focused gunfire and quickly disabled. USS Quincy engaged the Japanese, but was immediately bracketed by torpedoes and heavy shell fire. It was hit so many times that, at one point, shells passed through the Admiral's bridge, killing many officers. The ship sank quickly, becoming a raging inferno. USS Vincennes. The commander, Captain Reef Cole, fought back fiercely but was overwhelmed. The ship was hit by torpedoes and more than 85 shells, sinking within an hour. The entire battle lasted less than an hour. Mikawa's force sailed back up the Slot, escaping unscathed. The only damage they suffered was a few shell hits on Chokai. The Allies had lost 4 heavy cruisers sunk and 1 heavy cruiser severely damaged. The staggering human cost was that 7 Allied sailors killed compared to 0 Japanese casualties. The disaster at Savo Island was a crushing blow, exposing systemic failures in Allied naval doctrine and leadership. Failure of doctrine, night blindness. The U.S. Navy was focused on gunnery battles and daytime operations, underestimating the revolutionary nature of the IJN's night torpedo doctrine. The American commanders mistakenly relied on radar, still primitive and unreliable for target identification, while the Japanese relied on superior human optics and stealth. Fractured command. The division of command between Gormley, overall, Fletcher, air, and Turner, amphibious, coupled with Admiral Crutchley's absence during the attack, resulted in a crippling lack of unified response and clear orders. Lack of readiness. Many Allied ships were not at general quarters, full combat alert. Sailors were sleeping or relaxing after the relatively easy landing day. Some ships, like Canberra, mistook the incoming Japanese ships for friendly forces. Failure to warn. The initial damage to Chicago and the sightings by other ships were never communicated effectively up the chain of command or to the other forces. A clear, immediate warning could have changed the outcome entirely. Admiral Turner's desperate action. Following the disaster, Admiral Turner, with the immediate withdrawal of Fletcher's carriers confirmed, was left in an untenable position. He had to complete the unloading of the Marines, even as reports of an imminent full Japanese counterattack circulated. Knowing that Mikawa's victory meant the Allies had lost control of the sea, Turner ordered the remaining transports to withdraw immediately on the morning of August 9th, even though the Marines had only 5 days' worth of supplies. The Japanese had won a stunning tactical victory. The immediate consequences were dire. Marines abandoned. The 1st Marine Division, under General Alexander Vandergrift, was left isolated on Guadalcanal. They were critically undersupplied, without air support, initially, and had to immediately establish a supply system and defensive perimeter with what little they had. The Tokyo Express. The Japanese immediately began exploiting their night dominance. They initiated the Tokyo Express, running destroyers and cruisers down the slot at night to reinforce their ground forces on Guadalcanal, challenging the U.S.'s control of the sea and air daily. A new naval war, the Battle of Savo Island, and the subsequent withdrawal of the U.S. Navy forced a radical and rapid overhaul of American naval doctrine. The need for effective night training, reliable radar, and better torpedoes became an urgent existential priority. The remaining months of the Guadalcanal campaign were defined by this disaster. The struggle for the island would become a brutal, continuous test of wills, where the Marines' courage was constantly pitted against the Japanese's tactical superiority at night and the vulnerability of the entire Allied supply chain. The Battle of Savo Island stands as a grim lesson in military history. It was a failure not of technology, but of imagination and execution. The Allies were defeated because they failed to anticipate, failed to coordinate, and failed to respect the tactical strengths of their enemy. The naval blindness experienced that night cost the Allies ships, lives, and their initial strategic advantage, but it also forged the resolve necessary to win the long war. The U.S. Navy learned its lesson the hard way, and the subsequent 6 months of naval warfare in the Solomons would see the Navy overcome its doctrinal weaknesses, slowly turning the tide in the Pacific. The defeat at Savo Island was a critical crucible that ultimately ensured the long-term victory at Guadalcanal. The Marines left on Guadalcanal fought an unrelenting, desperate battle for survival, relying on captured Japanese supplies and the small, determined air power of the Cactus Air Force. To learn how General Vandergrift and his Marines managed to hold the line against overwhelming odds and the relentless Tokyo Express, please subscribe and click the next video on your screen now.